Know that song. It's by Nomi Shemer, and it's all about snow over my city, Jerusalem, I think. So it says, snow over my city, resting all the night. My love has gone to the warm lands. Snow over my city, and the night is cold. From the warm countries, they will bring me a date. The honey of the fig, the sweetness of carob, and a caravan of camels laden with all good things. Surely my heart's son will return here, and from there he will bring an orange. Snow over my city, resting like a talit. From the warm lands, what have you brought me? Snow on my city, sheleg al iri. Snow on my face, and within the fruit are all my longings. It's nice, right? Okay, moving on. So I have a few quick announcements before we bring up our guest. If I could have everyone's attention. Hi. Feel free to keep getting food and drinks. So first of all, our next Sholom Shishim event is our Hanukkah party on December 13th. So please make sure to register online. If you can't figure out the website, you can always call our office and they will get you registered. December 13th, Tuesday at noon. Questions? Okay. Shh. Okay. So a couple more quick announcements. Linda, you're on deck. Just putting that out there. There in one moment. So first of all, do we have any birthdays in the house? This month, coming up? Okay, Michael. When's your birthday? The 28th of November. October, the 28th of October, very recently. Any other birthdays? Past month, future month. Yes, Faye.
November 29.
November 29th. All right. Last call. Okay. So let's all sing happy birthday to Michael and Faye. 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Michael and Faye. Happy birthday to you. And many more. Hope you have a wonderful, wonderful birthday celebration or had. And a couple more things. So we have our JNF boxes coming around, as well as tickets. Okay, so make sure that everyone gets a ticket, because then you will be entered into the lottery for the tax receipt of the donation at the end from the boxes. Okay, so those tickets are coming around as well as the boxes if you want to make a donation. And has anyone gone to the Chutzpah Festival yet? I'm putting in a plug for it. Anyone been to the Chutzpah Festival at the JCC? Okay, so if anyone is interested, this Sunday, November 13th at 8 p.m., there is a special concert through the Chutzpah Festival at the JCC honoring Joan Becko of blessed memory. Many of you knew her. So it's going to be an amazing concert of her music. I happen to be singing in it, but also it's going to be a wonderful celebration of Joan. And the choir singing in it, our sisterhood choir, Joyce Cherry will be speaking. It's going to be fabulous, so make sure you get your tickets online for that. And without further ado, we have a special announcement about an upcoming Sisterhood talent show. More from Linda. Okay, so everyone listen to this very special promo. Here, I'll take this out.
Where do I stand? This one. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Linda, and I'm a chocoholic. I'm an addict. I love chocolate, don't you? It's so smooth and creamy on your tongue. And what can I say, but I think that it's better than sex, especially at my age. Yes, I know you all have chocolate hidden in your houses to keep it safe from the grandchildren when they come. You're just like me, I know you are. And now I'm getting such a craving. Oh God, does anyone have any chocolate here? I'm getting really horny. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. That was Linda's stand-up comedy, which will be featured at the Sisterhood Talent Show. Is there any way to get rid of the echo? Yes. Working on the sound levels. So Linda was just sharing one of her talents. If anyone has a talent, they're still looking for people to perform at the Sisterhood Talent Show. When is it again? Okay, more information online. But please sign up for the talent show and share your talents with our community. Thank you, Linda. All right. I think we're ready now. On that note, to welcome our very special guest today, Dr. Penny LeCouture, who has a Bachelor of Science and Master of Science in Chemistry from the University of Auckland, New Zealand, and a PhD from UC Santa Barbara. She was a founding faculty member at Capilano University in North Vancouver, where she taught in the chemistry department for over 30 years, and was the Dean of Arts and Sciences when she retired. She was an advisor for curriculum development at several universities in Eastern Indonesia, wrote a distance education chemistry courses for BC's Open University, and co-authored a Canadian grade 12 chemistry book. Her 2003 popular science book is called Napoleon's Buttons: 17 Molecules That Changed History. This was selected as one of 3 finalists for an award by the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. It was described by Entertainment Weekly as a splendid example of better reading through chemistry, and has now been published in 9 different languages. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. LeCouture. Turning your phone off, smart. Do you know what it is? It does, I can feel it. That back up. Okay. Can you guys hear us okay now? It's kind of echoing.
The only thing we can do is that instead of
We do 2. What if we just turn on 1 mic instead of 2?
I've got a pretty loud voice.
Yeah.
okay?
What if we turn this off?
Okay, so what we need to do now is,
Or let's see if that's better.
can you escape out and then start it up again?
Okay, I'm just going to test out. Is this better? Is this any better? A little bit, maybe? Now you want it louder. Maybe. We can try it. We can try it. Okay, we're trying this one now. Is this better? Okay, I think we're okay, Marielle. Okay, do you want me to take it out?
It's a bigger one.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Not too
Bouncy? Okay. I think most of you know somebody, or maybe you are somebody, who felt that they have a book inside themselves. Well, I was one of those people, and I managed to get it written, and so I'm going to talk to you about how I wrote it and how it got published. Now, for many of the years that I was teaching at Cap College, I find that I can hear an echo. Let me try it without. Can you hear me? No, you can't? Better to go back to this? Okay, will do. Now, when I was teaching at Cap College, no, that way? Okay, we'll get it right somehow. All those years, I knew people who were biologists, and they used to go to such interesting places. I had a friend who was an expert in rhododendrons, and he went all around the world looking at rhododendrons. And my husband was a geologist, and we knew many geologists, and they went all sorts of interesting places. And chemists don't do that. I mean, if chemists get a sabbatical, they go to somewhere like Akron, Ohio, which may be a very nice city. I hope I'm not insulting anybody, but it's not exactly exciting. So I said, one day I was going to write a book about chemicals around the world. And I actually wrote a list out, and I started with looking at all countries I wanted to visit. So I put down the country, and then I'd think of a chemical. And I kept that list, but nothing ever happened with it. And back in the 90s, Simon Fraser University asked me if I'd like to go to Indonesia to teach. They had a project involving upgrading of the basic sciences in some of the Eastern Indonesian universities. So I said yes before I said when and where. And this is where I ended up. It was in the west corner of the island of Sulawesi, and I think this shows you it, a small place called Manado. And here is a group of the students. You can see me, I'm in the back row somewhere there. The group of the students that I was working with, they were young faculty members at different faculties, Faculty of Fishing, Faculty of Agriculture. And one Sunday, they took me on a picnic. And we went up into the mountains behind Manado, and one of the things where they took me was to a cemetery. And they pointed out this particular gravestone because their ancestors used to bury people in stone sarcophaguses, and they would sculpt an image on them. And if you can see this, they said to me, these would have been Portuguese sailors. And you can see they've got the frock coats and the pantaloons, and they have very round eyes, which would for these people who lived there, would have been unusual. And I stood there and I thought to myself, boy, that was 500 years ago. And, you know, they'd come all this way. It had taken me 3 days to get from Vancouver to Manado, and then we had to go up into the mountains. But of course, I then realised what they were after, because all around me I could smell cloves. The clove trees were part of the forest. And in fact, everywhere where you drove around Manado at this season, they were drying the clove buds by spreading them out over over the road. So if you were driving, you had to avoid all these drying cloves. And I knew a few things about cloves, and here we have my first chemical structure. Now, there's not going to be a quiz afterwards, so you don't really have to look at the structures that carefully. What I'm trying to point out is just will be the differences and the similarities between some of these compounds. And this is the compound called eugenol, and it's what it gives cloves their very distinctive smell. I'm sure you all know what cloves smell like. And I knew something else about cloves. I knew that there was a compound called isoeugenol, and isoeugenol is different to eugenol only by the position of a double bond, when you can see it narrowed there. And isoeugenol is what gives nutmeg its distinctive smell. So that small change in where the double bond is gives you the difference between nutmeg and cloves. And I also knew that nutmeg originated on two small islands in the Spice Islands, about 400 kilometres from where I was on Indonesia. And I realised, of course, that that's why the Portuguese sailors were down there. They were down there to get cloves, to get nutmeg, to get the spices. So there is another compound in nutmeg called myristicin, and it actually gives nutmeg. The reason that nutmeg is sometimes called the spice of madness, supposedly, back in the 70s, when people were experimenting, I know none of you were experimenting with these sorts of things, people were taking nutmeg because they thought it was going to give them a high. And supposedly myristicin does, but you have to take an awful lot of nutmeg to get anything. You'd be very sick, I think. But you said there is a similarity with all these compounds. Myristicin, in fact, eugenol and isoeugenol are found in all sorts of other things. Myristicin is found in parsley, believe it or not, so maybe you can get high if you eat enough parsley. This is a nutmeg tree. This is the nutmeg plant. The red covering on the nutmeg seed gives us another spice called mace. And mace and nutmeg, well, to me, they smell very similar. Okay, so while I was there and I was thinking about this, I thought, there really were compounds that changed the world. They had all these people coming, all these sailors coming out from Europe to get spices. And that also struck me as interesting because, how many spice cookies do you need to make it worthwhile? Well, it turns out, this shows you the little island called Ternate, where they think that cloves originated, and this is the island in the middle of the Banda Sea, where they think that nutmeg originated. Totally different trees, not the same type of species, and yet they've got the same very similar compounds. So that led me to thinking a little bit more about maybe I should be writing a book. And I started to think about how it all came about. Now, this is Magellan's route around the world. Magellan started off from, Spain, and he started off, now, I may get these numbers wrong, he had 5 ships, and he had either 600 365 or 265 seamen on board those 5 ships. And he decided that he was going to sail a different way around the world. And the reason for this was that the Pope of the time had put a line down the middle of the Atlantic. And on the west side of that line, everything that could be discovered would not belong to the Portuguese. And Brazil is over there, and everything on the east side would belong to Spain. So, despite the fact everybody knew the world was round, maybe that Pope didn't believe it. So, what Magellan decided to do is he would go around the tip of South America. Now, of course, nobody had been round the tip of South America before, but it was assumed that you could get there. So he took off, went across the Atlantic and across the Pacific. Now, I don't know how many of you have been through the Straits of Magellan. Anybody? Yeah. It's pretty rough water, and just imagine you've got a small sailing ship, no GPS, no radar, no maps, no anything. I mean, I remember being on board a cruise going through the Straits of Magellan and thinking to myself, I wouldn't like to be on a small ship without any of those things. So he got round the tip of South America, went across the Pacific, and he ended up at, actually he filled up his ships. By that time, I think he only had 2 left, and he filled them up with nutmegs and cloves, and unfortunately, he got killed by locals at a small island off the Philippines, but one of his ships kept going, sailed around the rest of the world, and ended up back in Spain, in Portugal. Or was it Spain? I think that, the number of seamen who arrived back on that one ship was 18 out of the 375. It was in November 522. That is almost, it could be today. Today could be the anniversary, the 500-year anniversary of that. So I'm still thinking about why were they using, what did they use all the spices for? And the main thing was food preservation. Now, funnily enough, food preservatives have a bad reputation now. People don't want food with their preservatives in. I've got another talk where I talk about that, and I've got a lovely slide showing mouldy food and everything going bad, which is, you don't want preservation in your food, fine, here you are. But what they used, these were the traditional methods, spicing. So spicing was a major thing for keeping food preserved. Salting. Now, all of these things actually involve chemicals. They're all chemical preservatives. Salting, we salt food. Smoking, there are chemicals in the smoke. Drying and cooling. Whenever you dry, cooling probably not as much. Whenever you dry food, you get chemical changes in the food. So let's look at the modern methods of preservation, food preservation. Drying, freezing, canning, and chemical preservatives. Don't look too hard at that. I just took a picture of chemicals. Very few of those ones are used in preserving foods. So it was, without chemicals, you couldn't have the big cities that we have today. There's no way of getting the food into the city and keeping it. So that's why they were out, why they were down there collecting chemicals. It was for food preservation. I've put another one here. CFCs as refrigerants. These are the things in the fridges and freezers that we have. They're chemicals, so it's sort of secondary, but our food preservation does rely on chemicals. There was another reason, though I don't think it was a major reason, but there was another reason that they liked nutmeg. There was this theory that bubonic plague, which killed millions in Europe in those years, you could avoid bubonic plague if you took a couple of nutmegs and put them in a little bag and tied it round your neck. And we laugh at that. But you know, there might be something in it, because we now know that bubonic plague is actually carried by the fleas that lived on the rats. And nutmeg contains substances like isoeugenol, which act as deterrents or things that kill molds and perhaps an insect deterrent. So it is possible that maybe if you wore nutmeg around your neck, you got fewer fleas, and therefore you were less likely to get bubonic plague. Or it may be that if you were wealthy enough to have nutmegs, you probably lived where there were less rats and therefore fewer fleas. But this idea of, why they use spices as food preservatives was because it stopped mold, it stopped insects, those sorts of things. And that's what plants do. Plants actually are involved in chemical warfare. They can't move to protect themselves, so they do other things. And one of the things is chemicals. They produce some chemicals which keep the predators away, either by the smell or because they can't live with that compound. Think about things like stinging nettles and poison oak. That is chemical welfare. You don't go and touch those things if you know what you're doing, because you want to keep away from those plants. So then I realised that, of course, Columbus also was involved in the exploration, which resulted in he wanted to get pepper. He was out to find pepper. Pepper was very expensive. The reason why these things were so expensive, apart from the fact that they were in the tropics and Europeans had to go and get them from the tropics, is because to keep food preserved with spices, you have to lose an awful lot of spice. And if you'd ever looked at a recipe from one of these centuries, you would find that the amount of spice that they used would have made them inedible for us. And pepper was also a preservative, and they used huge amounts. And why salt and pepper go together is because if something was incredibly peppery, they would add salt because it supposedly masked the effect of pepper. So when people tell you that the food was much better in the olden days, you now know no better. Columbus went looking for pepper. He didn't find pepper, but he found peppers. The top structure is piperine, and that's the compound that is in pepper. The bottom compound is capsaicin, and that's the compound that is in peppers. And there are many of us who really love hot, spicy food and think that was the best thing that Columbus did, was bring back peppers to Europe, and from there it's spread around the world incredibly fast. So let's look at the chemicals we've looked at. We've looked at some compounds in spices, and all of these things end up being a chemical group called phenols. Now, phenols have the benzene ring. I can't point it out, I'll maybe try. That's a benzene ring, and you'll find it on many, many compounds. If it has an OH attached to it, it's called a phenol. So all of these compounds, even though they've got other things, are all phenols. And this started off the age of exploration. The age of exploration would never have happened if it hadn't been for another chemical. So that looked like a beautiful sailing ship, but what was happening below deck? And this is part of the reason that Columbus started off with 365 seamen and came back with 18. One word: scurvy. There are stories of finding ships with everybody on board dead. They took far more people than they needed because they knew that scurvy would start about 6 weeks after they left shore. And it's a pretty nasty thing. The connective tissues in the body start decaying, your teeth fall out, your fingernails fall out, it's extremely painful, and all sorts of other things. Now, there's one explorer whose name is really synonymous with ascorbic acid, right? Cook. And in fact, if Cook hadn't done this, I probably would be standing here talking to you in Dutch. Because the first explorer who ended up down in New Zealand was Abel Tasman, a Dutchman, but he didn't land there. He just sort of saw it in a distance. He went across to Australia, saw a little bit of Australia, called it Van Diemen's Land, and took off. But Cook was the person, and he didn't know what he didn't know it was ascorbic acid, but he knew that there were certain compounds or certain foods that would keep the sailors healthy. And on his trips, he never had one case of scurvy. There were all sorts of other things that they had, but he never had scurvy. And scurvy requires a lack of vitamin C, ascorbic acid. And from the structure you see here, you can see that it comes from glucose. And except for primates, the Indian fruitbat and guinea pigs, all other mammals make their own ascorbic acid. We have lost the ability to do that, which is why it becomes a vitamin. It's necessary for us to have it in our diet. In the body, if you can make it, if you're not a fruitbat, primate, etc., you make it from glucose, and there's a series of reactions which turns it into vitamin C. And this is the same sort of process that industrially we can turn vitamin C into ascorbic acid. Now, this is the point where I say to you, there is absolutely no difference between ascorbic acid, vitamin C, made by plants and the vitamin C that we make artificially. Chemicals are chemicals. The laws of chemistry apply, as far as we know, throughout the universe. So when you get people telling you it's natural, so it's good for you, don't be fooled by that. If it's ascorbic acid, it's ascorbic acid. So don't go and buy natural vitamin C sourced from delicate rose hips grown on the prestige slopes of the Himalayas and pay 10 times as much. Ascorbic acid is ascorbic acid. And I should also tell you that natural chemicals made in nature, are just as likely to be toxic as anything that man makes. I actually have another talk where it's called, It May Be Natural, but You're Just as Dead. But we won't go into that. So, sugar. Glucose is a component of sugar. Sugar consists of the molecule of glucose attached to a molecule of fructose. And sugar plays a big part in the development of the world too. In fact, when Columbus on his second trip took back sugar from sugar cane, took sugar canes from India, he took them to the West Indies. 22 years later, the first slave-grown sugar got shipped to Europe. And that set up the triangle where the slaves were brought out from Africa to the Americas, and the plants-based things that were sent back to Europe, sugar, tobacco, cotton, there were others of them, those are the main ones. And the profits and proceeds from those were used to manufacture things that were sent out to barter for slaves. And one of the major things involved here was cotton, particularly in the US. Sugar was mainly in the Caribbean, but in the US it was really cotton that was grown by slaves. And cotton consists mainly of a compound called cellulose, and you all know about cellulose. We need cellulose in our diet. And it consists of molecules of glucose joined together one after another in long chains. The interesting thing is that we can't eat cellulose, we can't digest cellulose because of the way it hooks up, but if you break it, it turns into sugar. But our bodies don't break it, so cellulose we use as roughage. There are animals that can metabolize cellulose. They actually don't break, they don't have the chemicals to break those bonds. It was done by bacteria in one of their stomachs. These are ruminant animals, things like cows. It's probably a good thing because if we had the right enzyme to break that down, instead of just having notices saying, please don't walk on the grass, there'd be notices saying, please don't eat the grass. So with all those bits and pieces, well, we've talked about pepper, nutmeg, cloves, ascorbic acid, glucose, cellulose, phenols, salt, and chlorofluorocarbons, which I just alluded to by CFCs in refrigerants. And at that stage, I started to go and look at what was available in bookstores in chemistry for popular science. And I went out to Metro Town, I went to a big bookstore, and I found there were shelves of physics, astronomy, mathematics, engineering, biology. Chemistry consisted of one shelf that they had to get me a stool to stand up on to see what was in it. There was very little in the way of popular science and chemistry. And I think it's something to do with the fact that chemists insist on bringing out chemical diagrams, chemical drawings, formulas. But I decided, well, this makes it worthwhile. And these are the chapters. Now, by this time, I had figured out, I had a sabbatical. So I said to myself I was going to write a book on now, having been in Indonesia and seen the clothes and all that, I thought this would be a great idea for a sabbatical. I never thought that I'd really end up writing it. I thought whatever I did, I could possibly come up with a couple of articles for the Journal of Chemical Education. But this turned out to be some of the chapters in the final product. Now, what else did I do? One of the things that I kept doing, I didn't write it from chapter 1 to chapter 17. I wrote bits of chapters at one time and then thought, well, that will be in this position, but then when various things would happen, I'd say, no, we have to move it somewhere else. I ended up having an editor, and her main thing that she kept saying to me is it has to flow. It's got to flow from one compound to another. Otherwise, it's just a collection of little bits and pieces. And that's what I spent most of my time trying to do when I was writing it, make it flow. So if you know anything about cellulose, if you react cellulose with nitric acid, you get nitrocellulose, which has another name. You can see here the little red arrows say that you've put an NO2 group onto where the OH part was, and that other name is gun cotton. So actually, if you nitrate anything, it becomes explosive. Now, think where we would be without explosives. Well, we might not have, and we would only have wars that would be run with bows and arrows. That may be a good thing. But look at all the railways that were built and all the things that we've done that we need explosives for. One of the things they also found out was that if you just nitrate cellulose a very small amount, it becomes you can make a fabric from the lightly nitrated cellulose that has very much the feeling of silk. And the first person to try this out was a guy called Chardonnay, and it was called Chardonnay silk. And silk was very expensive, and so this was a lot cheaper. Unfortunately, at some fancy ball where a lady was wearing a dress made of Chardonnay silk, some gentleman was smoking a cigar and the ashes fell on her dress and it went up in flames. So Chardonnay silk never really got started. But a lot of other artificial textiles have been developed, such as nylon. And the whole story of nylon then was one of the stories that I looked at. Another compound that is actually very explosive is picric acid. And picric acid was used because it dyes things, particularly silk, a most beautiful yellow colour. And dyes were a big business. Chemical dyes were a big business. The first artificial dye was made by an Englishman. Well, he wasn't even a man, he was a boy. He was an 18-year-old English schoolboy. And his father was a builder and allowed him to have a lab at the bottom of the garden. And over the Easter holidays, William Perkin decided he was going to try and make quinine. Now, he didn't know the structure of quinine, but he thought he could sort of stick bits of chemicals together and make it. Now, quinine, of course, it was very valuable, and it was sourced from trees in South America, and it was the first anti-malarial. So there's actually in the book there's a whole chapter on malaria and the anti-malarials and what we use now. Perkins actually didn't make that, but the compound he made, he called mauve, and it was one of those things that, serendipitous things. He had spilt some of it, and he took an old rag and he wiped it up, and then when he looked at it, it was this beautiful purple colour. And purple had always been a very expensive dye, and we'll see why in a minute. I was talking about the DDT comes into the chapter on malaria and the chapter on chlorinated compounds. Okay, so let's look a little bit about the natural dyes. Indigo. Indigo comes from a tree. It doesn't look blue when it's in the tree. And it's in the compound called indican. And indican contains a glucose molecule, but that's very easy to knock off. And if you ferment a mixture of the leaves from the indigo plant, you get something that looks like this, which is a derivative of indican, and air oxidation. If you leave it out in the air, it dimerizes, and all that means, you all know what polymers are. Polymer means lots of mers together, lots of molecules. Cellulose is a polymer of glucose. A dimer is if just two of them gets together. And this forms indigo. And these other two compounds are colourless, but when the two of them join together, you get indigo. And indigo and the production of indigo was probably one of the first chemical industries, even though it was a home industry. And now, I don't know, indigo now is made artificially, they make tons of it every year, most of which is used on blue jeans. I said that purple was a very expensive colour until Perkin came along. And the compound that they would get, the compound that they had as a purple dye was known as Tyrian purple. And it was sourced from a small murex shellfish along the coast in the very east of the Mediterranean. And supposedly if you go to the shoreline in parts of Lebanon, you can still see piles of these murex shells that were used, because it was a little gland at the head, and they used to have to, 9,000 murexes to give you 1/10 of a gram of Tyrian purple. And Tyrian purple with air oxidation also dimerizes, but the difference between Tyrian purple and indigo, I'll show you in a minute. It was such a valuable dye that only royalty or Caesars were allowed to wear it, And you can see, and that's still, if you have a look at I was going to say the Queen, but the King's coronation robes, purple is in it. And there's an old saying of somebody being born to the purple, which means that they were born into royalty. Okay, there we are. The difference between indigo and Tyrian purple is 2 bromine atoms. The Tyrian purple is dibromo indigo. So you can see how mauve, which you could make very cheaply in a lab, took over. And I don't even know if you can get Tyrian purple any longer. I kind of doubt it. The ancient red dyes, madder. You may have heard of madder. Madder comes from, is really alizarin, and it's a derivative of something called anthraquinone, and you'll notice that all the red dyes we're going to look at have all got the same anthraquinone base in them. Madder was and the dyeing of things that would be red with madder were part of a big industry in France, and French soldiers had their trousers dyed red. And we can look at some of the ancient red dyes. This is carminic acid. You might be able to see that those 3 circles for the anthraquinone are still there. And carminic acid comes from something, I think some of you will know this, called cochineal. Anybody know cochineal? My mum used to use cochineal. She would make a pink lady birthday cake for our birthdays, and it was a red food dye. And it comes from the cochineal beetle, which lived on a cactus that grew in the Caribbean area and some parts of South America. And the British had big cochineal interests in parts of Trinidad, and their soldiers wore red coats. In fact, they were called the red coats, and it was because they had coats made from cochineal. And in fact, the use of cochineal or carminic acid and the use of madder in France were probably the earliest examples of a government supporting an industry by decreeing that the army's pants would be red, or in case of Britain, the army's coats would be red. And you can see that it's got the same structure as alizarin. Okay, saffron, the most common yellow dye you would have come across was saffron, and saffron, totally different structure to give you the yellow. None of these circles, but there was long string of atoms. And saffron comes from the stamens of the saffron flower. You've probably, if you've ever used it, you've used it in paella. And people often talk about the monks wearing saffron-coloured robes. Actually, they don't use saffron. That's far too expensive. They use cumin for the dye, but people still call it saffron-coloured robes. So here we are. I've now added in nitro compounds, silk and nylon dyes, and something on about malaria. Okay, keeping going. If you look at what happened, the drug industry actually arose in Germany. And the first wonder drug was from the willow tree or meadowsweet. And that had a compound in it called salicylic acid. And salicylic acid was used to relieve the pain often the pain of arthritis. But before that, people used to make willow bark tea, and it was a pain reliever. It lowered fever, and it was anti-inflammatory. There was a chemist called Felix Hoffman, who was working for the Bayer company, so you know where this is going. And his father had very bad arthritis, and he couldn't stomach salicylic acid. It's very hard on the stomach. So his son thought, I wonder if I get rid of the OH group and I will do this reaction called acylation, and you're changing that OH to an OCO-CH3 group. Maybe that will make it a little bit easier. So in the lab, Felix Hoffman made this compound. He took some of it home, gave it to his father, and it worked like a charm. Now, this is not the way that we these days test out new drugs. You don't take it home and give it to Dad and see if it helps. But this, of course, became acetyl salicylic acid, or aspirin. And so the name aspirin was a name that Bayer came up with from the name for the meadowsweet plant, which was a spirea. Now, having been so successful, they thought they'd try again. They were going to try super aspirin. So what they did is that they took morphine, which has those AOH groups off the benzene ring, and they acetylated them. And they made diacetyl morphine, and they figured, well, if salicylic acid worked and acetyl salicylic acid worked even better, then diacetyl morphine from morphine is probably going to work even better. And it did. It was so amazing that they actually called it a hero drug, and its name, they named it heroin. Now, this is true, if you can see in here, it talks about, it says just their heroin. And this is, whoops, I've gone, let's go back. And they marketed it for women who were temperamental, I suppose, for children, for teething, and for all of these things. Now, it works extremely well because what actually happens is that when you acylate it, it means that the molecule goes through the blood-brain barrier very fast. And that's what gives people a high from heroin, and it is more addictive. Morphine takes a while to work, but it's still morphine doing it, but acetylating it just made it easier to get into the brain. Bayer Aspirin sued people who used the name aspirin. I suppose not surprising, they've never sued anybody who used the name heroin. And that was the beginning of a huge drug, like the 3 big companies in Germany, and they were the first people that got into the drug business. And I don't mean drugs in the prerogative way, I mean the way that they're very useful. And one of the drugs that we could look at is the contribution to society from this compound that is found in the Cabezo de Negro yam. It's a compound that has these circles. They've got 3 6-membered circles, but they're not benzene rings, don't have double bonds around them, and a 5-membered ring. And that, I'll point it out, this part here, that is the basis of a steroid. And you've all heard of the name of steroids. And the story on how they got from this compound that was found in yams to the birth control pill is I think one of the really interesting things, and that's one of the chapters. It goes to progesterone, and they still use the yams as a stock for it, and then they just do the chemical reactions, which brings it down to the first. That was the first pill that they ever sold. Very interesting, because some of the work was done in the early 1930s and 40s, and it was in 1959 that they first marketed it in the US, and it was marketed as to treat people that had women that had were having difficulty with their pregnancies, or differing with their periods, actually. And within 3 or 4 years, there were over 4 million women in the US who were having those difficulties. And in a few years later, there were millions of women around the world. And that has made a huge difference to the role of women in society. When you get control of your own fertility, life changes. Another compound, isoprene, naturally occurring, comes from the rubber trees. When you polymerize it, you get well, there's 2 ways of polymerizing. One is if you get things both headed the same side, and the other is if you go one headed one side and one the other. One's called cis and one's called trans. If you cis polymerize it, you get latex, and if it's trans, you get something in this case called gutta percha, which you might know. Young people have never heard of it, but it was what used to be in the middle of golf balls. And of course, vulcanization gave us rubber. And you think of all the things where we use rubber in our society. So that added isoprene, wonder drugs, the pill, morphine, nicotine, and caffeine, because the morphine chapter does contain some interesting stuff on nicotine and caffeine. So got 2 more things, 2 more chapters. Now, when I wrote my original list of countries I wanted to visit, therefore where can I find a chemical that fits, one of the places was Greece. And I decided, I could do olive oil. And my husband said, that won't work. And after I visited Greece and after I wrote the chapter, he read it and he said, you did it. So my contention is that this molecule, oleic acid, is the basis of Western civilization. So I've gone from thinking, were the chemicals who changed the world, to saying oleic acid is the basis of Western civilization. If you look at the history of Western civilization, starting with the Greeks, why was it that the Greece was able to develop the society they did? And the answer was that they traded in olive oil. And it's olive oil and the properties of olive oil, depending on, of course, this is a diagram and a chemical formula of a fat or an oil, and they can have different tails out here. And this one has got 2 oleic acid tails. And although oleic acid is present in other oils, there's more of it in olive oil than anything else, and it helps preserve it and all of the other things on which trade was necessary to be able to generate the income that allowed, I was going to say people, but it was only men, not women or slaves, to sit around in the middle of the city and discuss philosophy and geometry and all of those things that we use now from the Greek, our Greek heritage. I know it's a bit of a stretch, but I did want to go to Greece, and it makes a really good story. So we've now got oleic acid in there. One more compound, one more chapter. My favourite chapter, Molecules of Witchcraft. I had no idea when I started this how many women, mainly women though, sometimes it was men, sometimes it was children, it's almost always women, were burned at the stake or drowned or convicted of witchcraft during the 350 years that the witchcraft was being supposedly eliminated in Europe. These are just some pictures of the time witches being burned, witches hanging, and witches bruised. And of course, one of the things they were used was witches would use bark from the willow tree, which we now know, of course, was the forerunner of aspirin. Often these women would be single women, either widows or they'd never married. They would be poor. They probably lived on the outskirts of some town, and they possibly survived because they were herbalists. And a lot of our medicine, our modern medicine, comes from our knowledge of things in plants. They would have been able to use digoxin, which is present in foxglove, and they could have made a heart stimulant for it. Isn't it a wonderful structure? Look at it. You've got the top part of it, which is actually a steroid, and then you've got 3 sugar molecules, 3 glucose molecules added onto it. And if you look at something that was made in toads, it's called bufotoxin. Because you can cut off those 3 molecules of glucose, and you can cut off the tail of this, and the comparison is in these 2 compounds, they're very similar. The top one is a cardiac stimulant. Bufotoxin is a cardiac poison. And I remember telling some of my students this, and there's always somebody that said, "Oh, I know somebody that licks the skin of toads because they think it'll make them high." You know, more of this nutmeg stuff. So if you look at some of the old engravings of witches, they're doing an autopsy of a witch, and instead of pulling out of her heart, they're pulling out a toad. So toads were ascribed to witches. And then there's the broomstick myth. I figured this one out. I was at the Royal Society of England's Society of Chemistry in they've got a wonderful building and contains a terrific library of old stuff. And I was crawling up ladders and pulling things out, and I got some of this information that I'm going to tell you about. The myth about witches has always been that they could fly and that they flew on broomsticks to something that would be considered a ceremony, and it would be an orgiastic ceremony and women would be accused of this, And women who are accused of this often admitted it. Now, we know this is crazy, but what they did is that they had what they called a flying salve. And they put the flying salve contained these compounds. They would be compounds from the nightshade family. They're two chemical compounds called atropine and scopolamine. And mandrake, henbane, and belladonna are all members of the nightshade family. So are tomatoes and eggplants, but they don't have enough of these compounds in to be a problem. So they get these salves, and they had to put it on. It's absorbed. The salves would have these. They would rub it on, and it would be absorbed through the skin. And we know now that transdermal is one way of getting medication into us. But when I was reading this book in the Royal Society of Chemistry library, it said that they rubbed it under their arms and in other hairy places. And I was reading this and I was saying, really? And evidently, that's where the myth comes from. They would put the salve on a broomstick handle and apply it to the other hairy places. And that's why we now get pictures of, in Halloween, pictures of witches riding on broomsticks. That's where that comes from. These are the two hallucinatory alkaloid molecules. And when I said, why on earth would people admit to it? The answer is because modern day experiments have shown that these two molecules, the hallucination, you feel like you're flying, you've got, they're very like the descriptions that witches would give from about going flying on their broomsticks. Now, you wonder why would people do this? But think about it, and if you are somebody who had a very tough life, it might be quite nice to have. It's an escape. Let's go on a trip on the broomstick. It's why people used to take LSD. It's a trip. And that's probably why they did it and why they believed that they were actually flying. So I thought that was really interesting. Another interesting molecule is something that causes two diseases. There was a disease called St. Anthony's fire or St. Vitus dance. And they are actually due to the same thing. In St. Anthony's fire, you feel like you're, what happens is you end up getting dry gangrene, and your feet and your hands all go black and feel like they're going to fall off. And you can see sort of feet and hands hanging up here. And the other thing it does is it gives you uncontrollable movement, and that's where the St. Vitus dance comes in. We now know that this is due to something called ergotism. There is a mold that grows on rye or flour, rye mainly in Northern Europe. And you can see those little black clumps. That's the ergot mold, and it contains ergot alkaloid molecules. And the one on this one is called lysergic acid. You know where I'm going with this. And it has a side group which can be various things, various different things to give you different derivatives of lysergic acid. And those are what are responsible for the St. Vitus dance, and St. Anthony's fire, they would have had ergot poisoning. But maybe, it would have been in the bread, because maybe it had been a very poor, a very wet harvest, and the miller hadn't kept the grain dry, and the mould developed, and so when you made bread, there was mould, and it was these compounds would be in it. But perhaps the elderly woman who lived on the outside of the village couldn't afford to buy the flour. Or one village would have it, St. Anthony's fire, and another village next door wouldn't. So who would they blame? They turned round and blamed this elderly woman. She's a witch. And that's what they think happened, what it was actually in the Salem witch trials. It had been very wet fall, and they believed that maybe it was ergot poisoning. Ergotism poisoning still happens today. In the early 1920s, there was a case in France, so it's still something they have to look out of. And of course, then there was another chemist called Hoffman, not the same guy as the one who did aspirin, and he put his 25th derivative of lysergic acid, which he called lysergic acid derivative number 25, was of course what we now call LSD. He had gone home from his lab, and he was having all these weird visions. So he went back to the lab next day. It was better in the morning, and he tried some of the various things that he'd been working on, and he got one of his lab assistants to ride his bike home with him, and he had probably the first deliberate acid trip. And he took a huge amount, because it's a very, very small amount is what's required. So that's the Salem witch trial, and that was my last chapter. So I finished writing the book, and I decided, well, I'd have to try and sell it. And I had read that it's not worth doing anything. You can only really sell something if you throw it through an agent. So I went down to the local library. Somebody told me there's something called the Writers' Marketplace, and I looked it up, and they had a list of, big list of agents and what they'd be interested in. And they said, write a letter, and these are the things you should put in it. Don't make it longer than a page, because they won't read it if it's more than a page. So I kept making the font smaller. And I sent it off to 8 or 9 different agents. And the third one that came back said, send us a chapter. So I sent them off a chapter, and about a week later, I got a phone call, and the Jane Distal Literary Agency said, we can sell that, we'll take that. We'll take you on, much to my surprise. And I had at this stage written first drafts of about 6 chapters, and I'd done some of the research on the other. So they sent me some information on how to do a book proposal that they were going to present, and I worked on that and sent it to them, and they said, well, we'll send you a list of where we're going to submit it. And what they do, the agents in New York, most of the agents were in New York. I like going around saying, I've got a New York agent, I've got a New York agent. They were going to send me a list, because what they do is the agent has to talk to an editor at a publishing house, and the editor has to get the publishing house at an editorial meeting to agree that this would be a book that they wanted. And they don't want to take a book if you've already got 3 or 4 other people looking at it. So my agent knew who she wanted to go to, and she never sent me a list of the other editors she was going to. She phoned me and she said, "I've sold it." And you could have knocked me over with a feather. I never thought I'd write it, never thought it would be published, let alone anybody would read it. And so by now, I was off my sabbatical, and I had 13 months to finish writing it and get it. I've never worked so hard. But it came out, I had a wonderful editor. As I was saying, what she kept saying to me, flow, we've got to get the flow. It's got to read as in flow. And it came out in 19 years ago. It's still selling. I'm still getting royalties. It's out in 9 languages, and I've actually got some of them, a couple of the different languages here. I mean, it's out in things like Thai. It's Russian, Thai, Japanese, Thai, Korean, and Chinese, English, Portuguese, Polish, Italian and Russian. Not Germany and France, which most of it's about Germany and France. Maybe they're still to come. So if you want to look at that, I find it really weird to look at an edition. I know what it says, but I can't read it. So anybody got any questions? Oh, lots of them.
What is the reason for the name?
Oh, yeah, I should have said that. I told, the editor said, we need a name and you need a snappy introduction. And my name had been Molecules That Matter. And I had started straight off with talking about chemical formulas. And she says, no. And so I told her the story about Napoleon's buttons. Now, they're made of, the theory is, and this is a story that chemists like to tell to show how important chemistry is, but it's probably not true. But Napoleon's soldiers would have had buttons made of tin, and on the very cold weather that you get outside Moscow, tin in cold weather goes from being a metallic compound to being a crystalline compound. And so all the buttons on their trousers and jackets would have disintegrated, and they had to hold their pants up and their jackets together instead of holding their weapons. Now, it's probably not true, but as soon as I told her this story, she said, wonderful, great introduction, great name. And it has been.
Okay, is this not? Woo, okay. I think we have time for 2 more questions,
Okay.
and then you can always ask your questions afterwards. Okay.
I would just like to say my whole education life and working life has been in what you're talking about, straight through from education in dye stuff chemistry, through president of Sibagagi, or the Novartis dye stuff business in Canada. It's interesting. And I worked in the research lab for the with Cortals, the manufacture of synthetic, viscose at the time. And anyhow, my whole life has been in that chemistry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Roger.
I would like to say you're amazing. You've took a very, very complicated subject, and even I tried to understand it. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, go around to Leslie.
Sorry, I have actually two questions. One, gluten, the compound or the chemicals that that create gluten, where did that originate? And science is having a very tough time dealing with gluten. And the other question is with arthritis, the chemical compounds that created arthritis medications. In recent years, the treatments are better, but what is blocking the chemical makeup of arthritis medicines in improving arthritis?
Well, I'm not an expert in any of those areas. Gluten is actually, I know it sounds like it should be sugar, but it's actually a protein. When you're allergic to things, it's almost always a protein, and it's the protein that helps bread to rise. You know, Google gluten if you need anything more. And the thing about arthritis medicines are these things are very expensive to develop because so many of them don't lead anywhere. And, you know, I mean, you can't take them home and try it out on Dad any longer. It has to go through all the steps. And it's that sort of process that makes it so expensive. And, you know, I just think as time goes on, the medications will become better and we'll have fewer side effects, but maybe it won't be in time for me or you people.
Last question.
I just read yesterday that the Israelis in the Technion in Israel have just been able for the first time to take the H2O, the water molecule, and pull out of it green hydrogen. And this is an enormous advancement because once you're able to chemically separate the hydrogen, then you're able to develop energy.
Yeah. And it usually takes a huge amount of energy. You know, electrolysis is the way they separate hydrogen and oxygen. So you've got to go somewhere where there's low electrical costs. But they're cooking in green hydrogen. I will go online and read about it. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr.
You're very welcome.
Yes. That was so wonderful. I also love the part about the witches and history and just bringing together all these different topics about history and also like going down to the chemical level and how that has impacted so much of our lives today, even in Western society, as you said. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Yes.
Thank you.
Amazing talk. Before we break for you to follow up with our speaker, look at these books, I wanted to read out the winning ticket number. Okay, so everyone look at your tickets. This person gets to have the tax receipt for our donation. Okay, everyone ready? 0, 1, 5, 2, 3, 8, 4. Faye's the winner. Woo! Okay, so talk to Sheila. Talk to Sheila before you leave. And everyone else, thank you so much for coming. We'll see you again on December 13th for our Hanukkah party.